everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome, and welcome back to another video over here on That's Comical. And if you're watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. Well, it's been a bit, but Cammy and I are back for another DC animated live show, and I don't really know if this may be one of the very last, unless we decide to do something completely different and do a couple of interesting surprises. But based on what we have seen in regards to the movies that we're going to be reviewing today, it doesn't seem like Warner Brothers is going to have any brand new DC animated films coming down the line, except for the Watchmen Part 1 and 2 that they currently have on the way. There's a couple of interesting DC animated projects in the work, but nothing that pertains to the work that Cammy and I have been doing on this channel and on my channel previously. So, Cammy, I really hope that this is more of a see you soon and not an official goodbye. I mean, you and I will be on this channel numerous times, but doing these specific videos is something that I think you and I can agree on is a lot of fun and we really do enjoy doing. And it's going to be really sad if the DC Animated Library has come to an end because they've been giving us animated films since 2007. So it's been a nice library. So, one way or another, I'm glad that you were able to join me partially on this specific journey.
Yeah, it's been fun. I feel like I did step in on kind of on the tail end of it, but it has really exposed me to a new world of animation because I think, and we've had this discussion many times where I was just very focused on the things that drew my attention. Moreover, just like what else is in the library, what else is out there. So this has really broadened my horizons and introduced me to a whole new cast of characters that I probably wouldn't have otherwise cared about. So yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, and I think in regards to these three films, new cast of characters is very much an understatement because there's a lot of characters in this specific film saga because this was a very big project that DC Animation was working on just because of specific source material and the history and what it did for DC Comics. And that, of course, is the conclusion of the Tomorrowverse storyline, Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths, parts 1, 2, and 3. Of course, based on the almost 40-year-old comic book 12-part maxi series, Crisis on Infinite Earths, the one story that reconstructed the DC universe and comic books as we knew it. And I gotta say, ever since the DC animated library began, knowing that they were taking from various comic book stories, one of the things that was in the back of my mind was that there were two specific stories that I was hoping that one day DC would give us in animated form: Kingdom Come and Crisis on Infinite Earths. And I also said, believe it or not, this is no joke, when I was talking about that becoming an animated film, I had always said to my peers, this movie has to be told in three parts because it is just too grand of a story to just be told in one or two films. So I was absolutely floored when they announced that it was coming and that it was actually going to be told in three parts. So let's just say that I was very excited, but at the same time, there were a lot of questions flowing through my brain because of the Tomorrowverse as a whole not being one of the strongest series of films that we have had. I mean, we had some great discussions, you and I, Cammy. There were certain films that were definitely more interesting than others, but I think it might be safe to say, because I honestly have no idea how many of the other films before Superman Man of Tomorrow that you had seen up until this point. So I really don't know if you can totally agree with me when I say that this hasn't been the strongest series of films until we got to Crisis.
I haven't watched the whole thing, and my intent is to go back to the beginning and kind of just watch it from the start because now I have more of um a book to movie adaptation feel, where feel like I know the characters more. So when I see them brought to life on screen, I feel a different relationship than I might have if I just popped in, a DVD down the road and watch something. But that said, I've enjoyed the process. I've enjoyed all of the films that I've been exposed to, despite not having completed it in its entirety as you have. And I think, much like my reading, I think that by not having viewed everything, I don't have that full encompassing answer for you, because I feel like I've digested each film as we've taken them in, and I don't view it as a whole, like maybe your question implies. Um, However, this was a very epic way to end what they're calling part two of this, possibly the finality. But yeah, I think sometimes it is difficult in any version of a book to movie, book to animation, when you have creative minds on both sides of the spectrum, to kind of bring those pages to life. You have to be very careful to respect the writers and the colorists and the story itself. And sometimes when you have a story as epic as Crisis on Infinite Earths, you're going to have a very high level of expectation from the fans. You're not going to please everybody. You're going to miss some things, but you also have to adhere to the time that, you're not going to have the same amount of time that you hope for. I mean, it's like any epic film that runs 2.5, 3.5 hours, even those films tend to disappoint fans because you're looking for something that maybe didn't quite make it to the final cut for you. But I thought this was very well executed, and I thought that it did a phenomenal job of telling the story and hitting all the marks.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I can definitely say that when it comes to screen adaptations from source material, sometimes you have to make necessary changes for the purposes of cinematic value. And as someone who has read Crisis on Infinite Earths, I will definitely say that if you were to take those 12 issues and go page for page, line by line, you were not going to make a successful three-part film. It's a very dialogue heavy, very intricate piece of storytelling. And in the book's case, it's a great deal of show don't tell, because it's hard to really understand things just by somebody telling it to you. And if we were going to do that in the film, it just wasn't going to work. We needed to see more visually rather than just a dialogue heavy series of films, as opposed to what it was in the pages of the book. um I know that Marv Wolfman was actually part of the creative process of the film. Of course, knowing that it was coming for the purposes of saying farewell to the person who put it together with him, the late George Perez, knowing that they had announced that it was coming immediately after we found out that he passed, was a nice thing to hear. But there were some other things for me personally that I sort of didn't really necessarily hear clear cut, but it was sort of background noise, if you will. This was a storyline that was not supposed to be as short as it was. They actually did say that there were plans to continue the stories before we officially got to Crisis on Infinite Earths, but because of the fact that the DVD/Blu-ray sales were so poor, they had to find a way to wrap it up a little bit quicker. And that's what I'm saying. It's like when we see in this specific group of films, when you see standalone films like Green Lantern, Beware My Power, or Legion of Superheroes, there were, to me, it felt like there were so many things that were left undone and left unfinished. But to a certain degree, Crisis, I feel, really picks up the slack and tries to close those story gaps as best as they possibly can. And when you start the story off with part one, it's a Flash based story, obviously, based on when you even look at the cover. But That was a really great way in order to rope in some callbacks to some of the films that we had seen previously. Like there was a really great thing that I liked about the first film. And it was how we got to the point where the Flash and Green Arrow show up on Batman's doorstep at the post-credit scene of The Long Halloween Part 2. I thought
That
that
was
that was in,
epic.
I thought that was ingeniously done, and I was like, "Oh, so that's how Green Arrow got roped into this because he just showed up out of nowhere."
And I
And
remember you having made that comment when we did the long Halloween, like it was cool, but like, how did that happen? So I love that it came total 180 on us right there. And it was just like, boom. And then the 360 shot was okay. Now it all makes sense because we're time traveling. We've got all these epic characters. It was awesome. I
yes,
honestly, that was a very memorable moment from this movie.
yeah, I think the most important thing that Crisis, at least starting with part one, I think what they did right was they got you to remind yourself of those films, and now you get a little bit of a better understanding of the purposes of these films and why they did what they did and how they ended up where they were. The whole thing with the Justice Society World War II, there's some great callbacks to that film. There's some really good callbacks to Green Lantern Beware My Power. So I think another one of the best parts was when they were forming the Justice League and when they were calling all the heroes. When you see Green Lantern, it's not John Stewart, it's Hal Jordan. And obviously, you remember that Hal Jordan is also in the Green Lantern movie, so it makes total sense right there. So if there's one thing that I can give these three films credit is they really tied up the Tomorrowverse as best as they could in a very good manner.
And that's also what I'm saying too about, and I didn't like fully articulate my previous thought in that when you have creative minds and you're trying to resonate, you're trying to give that respect to the pages that you are bringing to life, but it's so difficult to pull everything out of these pages and give it life because you don't want to overwhelm your audience, you don't want to bog us down with too much time, and there's just so many storylines. And I think the beauty in being a comic book reader too is that as you're going through the pages, you're kind of creating this world in your own mind too. You've got all these beautiful visualizations and the colors just popping off the pages. And sometimes you have pages without dialogue that just speak for themselves, and that you can't always resonate that to the screen. But the difference is you do have these amazing images that are created on the film side that you don't necessarily get in the comic books when you are trying to kind of tie those together, whether it's bringing in characters or a storyline from another film or just trying to make it all make sense. And it's very challenging as a creator. So I definitely, give the nod where it's due and give due respect for that because, it's easy to be a critic, but to be a creator, which, you and I both are in the sense of the YouTube platform, we know that it can sometimes be difficult even to take an idea that we have and bring it to life. So, for that, I will always give that state of grace in that even though it might not be my vision fully, it's something I can appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely, because the whole story of part one with Amazo, that is nowhere in the pages of the comic books. But I
Right.
think the thing that's great about the Amazo story is it was the linchpin of the creation of the Justice League in this specific world. What was Flash's mission throughout this entire film? And more importantly, getting to the point where the heroes are visited by Harbinger and
Mhm.
they're all brought up to the Monitor satellite. And I mean, also, thank goodness they also did the whole thing with interrupting Barry and Iris's wedding, talking about how Batman, Wonder Woman, and Superman are already there. So I'm like, okay, well, at least you tied in War World well, even though I just cannot stand, I just can't stand that movie. I really do not enjoy it at all. But that was also really nice, and also the whole scene with the crime syndicate. So the crime syndicate, the reason why they're there is because of the fact that they are actually in the first couple of panels of the first issue of the Crisis comic. They are gone almost instantaneously because the purpose of showing the crime syndicate there was to show that these waves of destruction were plowing through the multiverse, and Earth 3 was one of the worlds that was taken in the comic. But I liked that in this film, they get a little bit more substance and it makes more sense because of the fact that we get the call back with the Flash being able to travel through the multiverse because of what happened with him in Justice Society World War II. So for him to not only expose himself to Earth 2, but also expose himself to Earth 3 and get a little bit more of dimension to the crime syndicate themselves, I thought that that was a really nice touch. Though I am going to say, if you haven't seen Justice League Crisis on Two Earths, that is a much better version of the crime syndicate in DC animation. Just saying. Maybe it's just because of the fact that James Woods voices Owlman. I don't know. But that's just me.
You're always the critic. No, I think, again, that's a perfect example of the difference of creative minds, because like for me, being new to comics of the vintage caliber, that was a confusion point when I first sat down to embody the works of Crisis on Infinite Earths on the pages. I was like, what is this crime syndicate and who are these, why do they look like the Justice League? So to kind of see that different visualization in this film was really appreciated, because like you're saying, they gave them more texture and more dialogue and they were a little bit more present, so it just felt a lot more natural. And two, it also embodies kind of a more modern feel on a vintage take. It's sometimes challenging to take something that is so beloved and is nearly 4 decades old and kind of give it that new punch and pizzazz and make it make sense to a newer generation. And I'm not saying that you have to do that. By all means, you can always bring vintage into the modern and people will just either love it or hate it. But it's kind of cool to kind of see that concept where you can kind of give something old a new flair but not ruin the masterpiece.
Right. I mean, I also think that there was a very interesting twist in this first film, and that was when you get to the Watchtower, it feels a little bit more prominent, and that is when this Earth's Batman meets an alternate dimension version of Robin, because we see that actual Batman uh, taking care of Dick Grayson in his world, and he actually doesn't have him stay around to be his ward. Instead, he gives him to an orphanage. But then he meets this, not just this one Robin, but he meets Huntress for the first time, who is in an alternate dimension, the daughter of Bruce Wayne and Selina Kyle. So the fact that this Batman, who is in fact a loner, and I gotta be honest with you, I've seen Batman fly solo so much, but maybe it's just because of the fact that it's very hard to think about Batman not having any kind of Robin in his world at all. To me, it just doesn't personally sit well, but maybe that's just because of how Batman is such a major thing in my life.
Well, Robin's a quintessential sidekick, but it's fun when you get a cast of characters like this together, because then you get to see the multi-dimensional versions of Robin, and you get to see him as variations of ways we've experienced him through the written work and also other animated series, television shows, movies. So it's really fun to kind of get those one-liners from Robin. And there was a lot of touching moments from other characters, kind of giving nods to the appreciation of who they are and what they meant to them. And I think Robin was definitely a prime example of that, of just how important Batman was to him and what he did for the young version of himself. So there was just a lot of touching elements in this film that I think sometimes aren't given enough life when it's discussed by the critics that somehow found a lot of fault in parts 2 and 3.
I mean, I love when we officially get to the Monitor's tower, when we meet the Monitor for the first time, because it's not one of those moments. The other moment that I really like, because there's one thing that I can say that I love in this specific film, and it carries on into the next two. I love the version of Aquaman that we get in this film,
Yes,
because that is,
yes.
first of all, that's a nod to Peter David's 90s Aquaman, the
Mhm.
long blonde hair and the harpoon hand. That's the Aquaman that I grew up with. And I also love, to a certain degree, how they did also say, well, at least you're not on the side of the Nazis this time. And I'm like, oh, there's another callback to another one of the films, which I really, really like.
Yeah, I definitely felt that with Aquaman. And it's funny that you always tend to kind of hone in on the things that really resonate with me. And Aquaman was definitely one of those standout characters because I felt like he embodied the version of that Momoa gives him in the the Justice League films, because he felt very masculine, he felt very in charge, he felt like a leader. And I really, really appreciated that, because sometimes you do get a very um I don't know, just a very subdued version of Aquaman, and you don't really get to see his full potential. But here you got to really just encompass the Atlantean that he is and the power that he possesses. And when he comes, face to face with the Phantom Pirate, and you get to feel like, hey, dude, you're in my territory now. Don't mess with me, and I love
Well,
that when you get to see that.
yeah, I mean, Bruce Timm did that too in episodes of Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. I mean, again, you're absolutely right. Aquaman, if you go back to like the Super Friends days, you always think of the guy that rides the giant seahorse, and he's like such a goofy character. But no, there's so many things that people forget about Aquaman. They forget that he has super strength. They forget that he has impenetrable skin. And that's why I always say to people, if you want to see a truly great Aquaman, you have to read Peter David's Aquaman, because that's when you really get to see this brute force of a hero. And like, a guy who just doesn't take any BS from anybody. I love that. But we also get the Monitor. I was also really curious to see how the Monitor was going to be portrayed in this film, and it's definitely everything you can expect from this specific character. It was just so cool to actually see all of these different heroes in one place all together. And even just like for me personally, just pointing out all the ones that I recognized and noticed. And so, of course, the Monitor gathers them all together, tells them exactly what the stakes are, that the multiverse is on the verge of collapse. And we have to put these mechanisms on these various Earths, charge them up to allow these waves to pass through the planets and not destroy these various Earths. And that is when we see all of these various Earths, and we get everyone from the Justice Society to characters like Amazing Man. And then, of course, you gather all of these brilliant minds to work on the Watchtower, including Blue Beetle and Mr. Terrific and the new character, Dr. Light. I'm curious about your thoughts about Dr. Light, because she actually was also a character that was introduced to the world of DC in the comic books and this specific story. The one thing that they did say is that you possess all the powers of the villain Dr. Light. Well, that's true. And that's exactly what happened in the comics. But it's really weird to say a line like that and never feature Dr. Light in any of the previous films to explain who this past version of Dr. Light was. But that's neither here nor there. If you never picked up a DC comic book and you read Crisis on Infinite Earths for the very first time, because when we talked about that here, Andy and I, on the show, on the first episode of Ultimate Journey, we do consider Crisis on Infinite Earths a great jumping on point for people who've never read DC Comics. But that's still going to be a very confusing thing to hear.
Yeah, but in that particular case, I fault the viewer because, if you're gonna just simply watch the animated films for what they are, they're a beautiful showcase, and that's great. But if you want to be a critic of the films because there are certain things that are left unanswered, then that's the fault on you as the viewer for not picking up the comic book. Because you, or not you specifically, but the creator of the film cannot be held responsible for explaining every little thing. That would be like adding subtitles or adding context or putting some kind of glossary at the end of every film. If you really want to be a true watcher of these films and understand fully the story, the characters, their history. Yes, it's a lot. You're
It's a
speaking to
lot to
the
take
choir.
in.
Trust me, I have picked up an enormous amount of backlog issues just to kind of try to keep up. But I think something as epic as Crisis on Infinite Earth needs to be read, and there's nothing wrong with viewing it first. I mean, that should certainly captivate your interest and get you, curious about some of these characters. But the films don't even cover the full cast of characters that you get in the comic. There are many characters that are not even covered, or their storylines, and the dialogue reference there is the same. I think she's an amazing character. I am very female forward, so anytime I get a new female character, it's always an empowerment, and it's even more powerful to know their backstory. So, I say if you are one of those critics who are out there and you feel like her story wasn't given enough justice, well, pick up the damn comic book, or pick up a series of comic books. Go back to that age of comics, the golden age of comics, and enjoy her stories for what they are. But I think for what they did for her on film, it was just enough. And I think that sometimes we also have to kind of respect that there are certain characters that you don't need to embody their full storyline in order to appreciate where they showcase or show up in the films.
Yeah.
I think that in some cases, like in her case, it was just enough and it helped to carry the story, because really in that moment it was all about Supergirl. It was really about her story in that moment. So I think to give her any more, or to give us any more of her backstory, would have felt very unfinished. It would have felt very rushed, and it would have just been unnecessary because our focal point needed to be with Supergirl in that moment.
Yes, and speaking of Supergirl, I'm glad that you brought her up because obviously that's where we get the call back to the Legion of Superheroes, where Dawnstar shows up and Brainiac 5 is referenced. There was a major change in this story, and I gotta say, this was a very good thing to do because in the comic books, Supergirl is not Harbinger. Harbinger is a separate character in the world of DC. Her name is Layla, and I personally felt that making Supergirl Harbinger was a good idea for the movie. It would just confuse you if we just added an additional character for the purposes of being the Monitor's messenger. And I feel that it adds more to Kara's character, and we'll get into that a little bit further when we analyze part 2. But yes, she's the one that is calling on all these heroes to join the Monitor and help fulfill his mission. The
Yeah,
other,
and
yeah,
as a viewer, I can say I appreciated that also, because as a reader of the comic, there's just so many characters to keep up with. And, I'm kind of a little meticulous when it comes to reading and keeping my story straight. So there was a lot of note taking while reading Crisis on Infinite Earths. So as a viewer, I can appreciate when they combine characters like that. I can see from a critical standpoint where a true blue reader of the comics might be a little irritated, but for the sake of time and the sake of confusing a viewer, it's because in that instance you have to side with the viewer and not with the reader. You're there for an animated film, you're not there to decipher page for page the comic book. So that was a very good decision on the end of the animators.
there were three major changes in this specific beginning. It was what they did with Supergirl, the story with Amazo, and the biggest change of all was the whole story about the Flash, the whole thing with his relationship with Iris, going back to the very beginning of his origin, his wedding, him and Iris still fighting the waves at a different point in time at old age, just seeing their whole relationship through this entire thing. I think that's what adds so much more depth to this specific film in general. And yet somehow the Flash's death still seems extremely uneventful because it was very uneventful in the original source material too. He just went up and died. It was just like, okay, he's dead. And like you didn't really feel so bad for the guy.
He got old, and I mean, don't we wish that for all of our superheroes? I
Well,
mean,
thank God in this film he just got old. In the books, he flat out disintegrated.
this is true. No, I think the way that they did it, it really does pay homage to all of the past storylines of the Flash. I mean, it gave a lot of life to his character by combining all of these ideas and all these concepts. I think it allotted for a lot of continuity within these three films because it allotted for a lot of consistency and some kind of realistic premise for the whole time travel. You know, it really just made it all make sense because you're taking out elements of his life, and you are able to see him kind of grow old and witness all of these you know, just big events in his life, when he got his powers, when he got married, you know, when the Justice League formed, you know, all of these really epic things. And it's happening while all of these different earths are, you know, simultaneously being destroyed, and you're seeing these introductions of other characters. So I don't know, for me as a viewer, I thought it was great. And yes, there was some anticlimactic points in the Flash's storyline, but in a way it kind of humanized him too. You know, you got to see a lot more Barry Allen than you got to see, you know, just the character the Flash. You got to see this really just real love story. And people get old, and people, you know, after a while our superheroes are going to age, you know. It takes me back to the story that we read, you know, not so long ago about Superman, and watching him age and watching him have children. And you know, I don't know, in a way it's kind of touching to see that on occasion, you know, because
Well, don't forget.
we put our superheroes on a pedestal, and we assume that they're immortal and they're human.
Well, don't forget, in this film, you also see the Justice Society as a much older group, except for Wonder
Right.
Woman, because you saw them in the original Justice Society World War II film, they were much, much younger. So that was also, and don't forget, even their version of Superman is here too. That's found very interesting. I was really surprised that they only gave us two of the same hero. But then again, I think maybe that's not necessarily true. But I think that's also just a call back to the comic because when it came to seeing different versions of the heroes, they particularly made sure that you knew that in this story, there were two versions of Superman in this story, the current version of Superman and the older, aka the Golden Age version of Superman, which is obviously the Clark that we met in Justice Society World War II. But yeah, I mean, the whole love story with Iris and Barry is not even in the book as well. And I just feel that for cinematic value, it makes so much sense. One day I have to remind myself when I officially watch all of these films back to back to back, I got to remind myself that when I'm watching Justice League War World to see that moment when Batman is in that dream sequence and he sees that old version of Barry in the water. I'm like, I couldn't even remember if I saw that or not because I had fallen asleep in that while watching that movie so many times. Justice League War World, not Crisis.
I don't hate that film as much as you do. But that said, no, I do think, yeah, it is moments like that. And there were different characters we got to see different versions of. And again, I think that pays homage to the t- uh, the tale of time, the stance of time, you know, just how many times we've been subjected to these characters on different platforms, in different versions of themselves, and on different earth platforms. You know, I think the multiverse is something that is a lot to digest, and I think for the average reader, you know, that just kind of comes into this blindly, it's a lot to take in. And I think that films like this do a really great job of reminding us about all those little nuggets that stay with us and all of those different storylines that we love so much.
So, I mean, I think this is definitely one. I think out of all the films, I think this is the strongest one for me. But also, when it came to all of these films in general, they really were never truly strong for me at all. But I would say that if I was going to rate this film, I would probably just give it a very strong 3 stars out of 4. Like, it's not a bad movie at all. It's just like you said, it's a lot to take in. But if you've been following along, it's not necessarily hard to jump on board of. So yeah, that's where I basically leave my thoughts in regards to the first part.
I thought the first one was really solid. I thought I did a great job of captivating your interest. I think it gave you a good stopping point, and I think it left you wanting more. So, every time we do this, let me rate the film. I always forget how I rate films because you do it, I think, on a 4 star, and I'm like, wait, how do I do
Before
it?
you do,
I
I
just
think you do. You've gone from like 5 star ratings to thumbs ups or thumbs down. So you don't want to
I
rate it, don't rate it.
I think as we come into 2025, I need to have like a bona fide rating system so I don't look like such a movie dunce. Because you're right, I have literally rated it on every scale. So just for the sake of continuity within this rating, I'll give it 4 stars because I really did think it was solid. I think it hit all the marks. I think it was a believable writing. I think it was just visually very appealing, and I think that any film that you anticipate more coming, you want it to kind of leave you and leave the feeling on a cliffhanger, and it did just that for me. It left me excited about part 2. So
Right.
4 stars.
And right. Okay. So then we get to part two. Part two for me, I think, has a lot of very interesting moments and a lot of good Easter eggs. But I actually think out of the three, it's the weakest one. That's just my thoughts right there to start because I can definitely tell that in regards to while part one is a Flash story, part two, without a shadow of a doubt, is a Batman story. And it basically starts off, of course, with the Joker doing things that Joker does, because he does have a very similar small role in the comics. And then we get a very interesting surprise when we see that Batman is not fighting alone. He reluctantly has a whole Bat family following him, trying to get on his good side. And that's when we not only, and we had already been introduced to Dick Grayson's Robin, the Huntress, but then we get a big surprise. We get Damian, and we get Terry McGinnis, aka Batman Beyond. I gotta be honest with you, I had no idea that they were even going to stick him in when the trailer showed up. I was like, wait a minute, is that Batman Beyond's in this movie? What is going on here? Because
I think that was intentional for the
yeah,
potential future of the DCAU because I think that in the event that they do another wave of films, given Kevin Conroy's absence, I think that they wanted to use his character more. That's the rumor that I've heard. Now, I am definitely not as versed in the world of comics like you are, but that was kind of the rumor that I picked up from all of the chatter because obviously we're not going to be graced with his presence, and because of his departure, we're also no longer going to be getting
Mark Hamill.
Mark Hamill, thank you, as the Joker. So I think they're kind of setting us up for the potential future of voice animation. Um, but I mean, I don't know how strong his character would be as as our bat. I don't know.
Well,
I mean, you can't give us another Conroy. You can't. But
well, the thing is, well, first of all, it was nice to know that Will Friedle came back to voice Terry because that's the guy who originally did that. Now, I think that there was no serious substance for him being in this movie whatsoever. I seriously believe that he was here as an Easter egg for the fans because it was Crisis. Let's see different time periods and different timelines. And we also have to remember that Batman Beyond was conceived through DC animation. He was an animated character before he ever graced us on the pages of comic books. This was a Bruce Timm creation
Who
from
did you say
1999.
voiced? Who did you say voiced him?
Will Friedle, who played Eric Matthews on Boy
Oh,
Meets
okay, okay.
World.
I sorry, I didn't hear you correctly. I was like, okay, just wanted to make sure. Yeah,
No,
but see,
yeah,
I love Will Friedle though. I think he's fantastic, and
he
he has
is.
done so much animated voiceover work.
Yes.
I think that he really fits. So I do hope that there is something to the rumors and that they do want to use him more.
Well, Will Friedle has said if he's ever been tapped to come back to voice Terry, of course he'll come back. I mean, there's two animated projects that he says that if he ever gets the call, he'll come back for them. And it's Batman Beyond and Kim Possible. He gets the call, he comes a running. That's what he
I
said.
love Kim Possible. I am the biggest fan of Kim Possible and Ron
He will
Stoppable.
come back for those two roles because he's loved doing those roles in his career.
They're fabulous. That is one of the best animated cartoons ever.
But it was very interesting to see this character thrown in. I kind of like the fact that they did this because this is DC animation, this is Bruce Timm, this is for the fans, and it was all. And he is part of the Bat family. I mean, what I found really weird was later on when we officially discover the Shadow Demon showing up. How out of nowhere Batwing is there, and I'm like, well, why wasn't Batwing there before? Like, why is he here now? Like, he literally just showed up. He didn't say anything. So I was like, okay, that's a little bit sort of out of continuity, but I'm just getting ahead of myself. The point is here, the big piece of the story is we discover two specific things. We discover Supergirl's past. We discover the big gap in between the destruction of Krypton and her going to the Legion of Superheroes and coming back and becoming Harbinger. It was just like, how did she become Harbinger? That was probably the biggest question because we didn't know she was Harbinger when she shows up at the end of Justice League War World. We discover that she's Harbinger in Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earth Part 1. So we now discover how she became Harbinger, and it's a very, very good story. We see that she was not just crashing onto Earth. She actually was intercepted by the Monitor, and he basically became an adopted father to her. And eventually, when she just discovers the truth about him just watching planet Krypton be destroyed and finds out that she has a cousin, she heads to Earth, and that's how she ends up on Earth in the Legion of Superheroes. So that made a lot of sense.
Made a lot of sense, but it was a very heartbreaking story. I
Oh,
think that
yes.
was probably the most difficult. Obviously, I feel that her story and the relationship between her and the Monitor was a huge part of part two.
Yes.
But to watch it all unfold, I mean, you really get a twofold story there. I mean, of course, you get Supergirl as Harbinger and the the destruction of her planet, but then you also see kind of a breakdown in the Monitor of him doing some self-reflection and what his purpose is and why he's there and why does he make the decisions that he makes. And a lot of that is obviously influenced by the anti-Monitor, but you do get kind of that twofold story there, and it's all very heartbreaking to watch.
Yes, and then there's the other big thing. And again, this is something that didn't happen in the comics, and I'm glad that it happened here in the movie. And that's where we go deep diving into the world of the origin of Psycho Pirate. Psycho Pirate plays a
Dark.
big role in the comics, and it's a very interesting role. But I loved. If I think this is like the highlight of the movie for me, seeing his origin story and how he came to be, and finding a better understanding of his powers, and how eventually the Anti-Monitor reveals himself and how he is using Psycho Pirate. Originally, how the Monitor was using Psycho Pirate, and how the Anti-Monitor finds him, abducts him, and says, you don't want to use your powers this way. You want to truly use them this way, and this is what I'm letting you do. But Psycho Pirate had been animated once before. He was in the last season of Justice League Unlimited, but he was a background character. But he's a crucial character in Crisis on Infinite Earths. So in part two, we get him, and we get a big version of him. What did you think of this character?
Loved him. He's dark, he's mysterious, he's evil, he's twisted. He's very self-centered. But you know, obviously we see with his origin story, there's a reason why our villains turn to be our villains, because they are tortured and tormented, you know, and he just used that to his advantage. I think that having him have that origin story was very important because, again, this is kind of the book to movie. If you are not a reader, or have not read, and you're just there for the animated version of the story, then you're definitely going to want to understand that character because he does have such an important role in this storyline. So I thought that was very well executed, and I do feel, having watched as many DC animated films as I have, getting those origin stories is just really special, you know, and you do see that often. And to get that here and with this particular character was a lot of fun. And to watch him kind of evolve and what happened and what he became in the third was really cool. And I do think it kind of played justice to the written word, but obviously they had two very different endings.
Yeah, because one of the few things that we do not know about Psycho Pirate that we get in the movie is the fact that he tries to conquer different dimensions. We never knew that about him. It's not even shown there. You would never even think that he was that type of person. This is a nice little added piece to him because it goes back to his origin. He sees what his powers can do, and it's like, if I was able to do this, and let me tell you, what he did in that boarding school was gruesome. I think
It
that that was
was.
like, I think that was the dark. I think that was one of the darkest things I ever saw in DC animation. I've seen some really dark animated
With the
films.
exception of the Constantine story that you had me watch when we first got started,
City of
yeah.
Demons.
Yeah, that was pretty intense, but this was the second, bar none. I was like, oh my God, this is intense, you know? But I just think it really then kind of plays into what's going on inside his head, you know? I mean, on the surface, sometimes you get this version of him that you're like, oh, he's not so bad. No, he's kind of that bad, you know?
Yeah, and one of the other things I also really loved about these three films was how they tied in some of the DC showcase shorts because we had a big scene, which actually does happen in the comic books. I was actually a little surprised that it was actually thrown in there because it didn't I didn't think it would be such a significant thing in the films, but that was the whole situation with Commandy and Solivar. The fact that Commandy was fearful of this big gorilla because of how he lived his life, not knowing that Solivar is actually a very kind and distinguished leader of his people, and how he tries to explain to him that you have to understand, I know what it's like to be a minority. Because, like he says, in my world, Gorilla City is a hidden city and the human beings don't know of us. So the fact that he was able to build that trust with Kamandi, especially when Solivar passes away, it makes that scene all the more emotional. And for the short amount of time that those two characters are on the screen, that is a very, very serious and very impactful part of the story.
Oh, without a doubt, those are two of my favorite characters, bar none. I think that with Commandy, it kind of just takes us back to the early days of DC Comics, and I don't think people, you know, realize that he has a really vast catalog. You know,
Yes.
he was a really important character,
Yeah, he was big
and
in the 70s.
huge. And I absolutely love the relationship that those two formed, and forged together. The trust between the two of them was just instantaneous, and I think that really helped the dialogue flow very quickly. The relationship is just such a beautiful thing to watch, and Solivar is an amazing character. I was so heartbroken that he passed, and you know, he wasn't able to continue on in the journey, but I think that it is important for us to lose characters that are very meaningful to us, because again, it adds that reality to even these fictitious worlds that we create. But I just think that there's just so much context in the short scene between these two very powerful characters, and I'm so thrilled that they made it into this.
Yeah, and I mean, there are two other stories that do take place here. There's also Wonder Woman's story, which for me personally, like, I don't think it was as deep as some of the others. For me, the whole story with Wonder Woman was a little forgettable, but that's just me.
It
Um,
felt very rushed and very
yeah,
just, I don't know. I mean, I know the importance of Wonder Woman, and I certainly understand her importance in the continuation of this storyline, having, its end. We know what she sacrifices. However, um yeah, she just felt very forgettable, which is unfortunate because Wonder Woman is a very powerful character, and she does hold a lot of prominence in any scene that she is involved in. Even the relationship that she had with her mother, even though we see her step into, I believe it was Earth 3, and so it really wasn't her mom, but it was her mom,
it was her.
that
It
was
was, it was Hippolyta who never had Wonder Woman as a daughter.
no, right. But again, that what I'm saying there is, it just that felt very uncomfortable, because the dialogue between them just didn't feel natural in any capacity. It was just very odd.
So through the whole thing with the invasion of the shadow demons heading to where the big time wave disruptors are, that's when the team that's still up in the watchtower starts to see the layers getting peeled back, and they find that the shadow demons are pretty much a big distraction, and the fact that Puppet Master had been abducted to manipulate all the characters and have them fight against each other and not the true villain at hand. And that is when we discover the Anti-Monitor and that he basically wants to destroy the multiverse. But there's another character that reveals himself, and that was probably, when it happened in part two, I was like, okay, this is something. But when it goes into part three and starts taking shape, I'm like, whoa, this is actually pretty darn awesome. And that is the fact that through the first two films, there's a decrepit old bum that is following the heroes all around. And it's not until John Stewart discovers that it happens to be John Constantine. And I'm
That's
like, whoa, okay. And also, let's just say, because we have praised it enough, they got Matt Ryan back to voice him, and that's all that matters.
Yeah, he's a great character. He's dark, he's funny, he's witty. I think that anytime John Constantine is on the scene in a DC film, it's always going to be a good time. So,
Because it's Matt Ryan. Because they're never gonna use anybody else. It's always gonna be Matt Ryan.
no, he's really fantastic. He's just very charming and in all the right ways. His character is very troubled. Obviously, he's very tormented, very drunk a lot. But I think that it definitely added a lot of substance in this storyline, and I think it was really cool to kind of see him rediscover himself in a way.
And so then that goes right into part three. But before we do that, I would probably rate this film a 2.5 stars out of 4. I just, there's a lot of very dull moments in this film, even though that there are a lot of positive things in this film. But like I said, when it comes to movie trilogies, one of two things is always going to happen when it comes to that middle part. It's either going to take the story to the next level, or it's just going to be a way to drag the story on till we get to the climax. And I think that Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 2 was just a stalling point to just drag us into Part 3.
That poor second film is like the poor middle child. It's just,
Yeah,
it's not always the greatest. It does have some integral pieces from either remnants of part one, or as you're saying, to kind of lead us into the journey of the finality in part three. But I do believe you are correct here. I think I would agree with you since we're on the star kick here for this. I'll give it 2 stars. Because I do think that there are some, great things that happen here with certain characters, but I don't think overall it was like, wow, you've got to see this. It's just you've got to see this because it ties in 1 and 3.
Okay, so when we get to part 3, we discover that through the big battle with the Anti-Monitor, we discover that the last remaining worlds in the multiverse were saved and put into a pocket dimension called the Bleed, where they could be safe from the Anti-Monitor. The problem is when those worlds are in the Bleed, they can sort of bleed into each other. Hence why there is a big battle in Metropolis with some of the superheroes and dinosaurs, which is something that happens in the comics. That does happen in the comics. But the best part about that is how the losers from the DC shorts show up. I loved the fact that the losers show up. I love the fact that Adam Strange shows up again. And I also love that when they're trying to bring Constantine back to consciousness, I love how they're on Earth 13, which is a Wild West world, and how Wonder Woman encounters Batlash and remembers him from her dream on Warworld. I thought that was another. See, again, as much as I dislike Warworld, I do love how they properly tie in these other films.
And I think that's why I don't hate on it as much as you do. Don't get me wrong, it's not my favorite, but I think there's a lot of really commendable things that happen in that film and give us the right storylines and just these little tidbits that we can use later within the animated universe that makes sense. So I definitely appreciated that. Who doesn't love dinosaurs? I absolutely love that combination. I'm glad we got to see it on screen because you definitely get that in the comic. But I thought that was a really great, fluid, well thought out, well written storyline. I think the way that the characters interacted, I think the dialogue was spot on. The whole thing just really worked for me in
And
terms
another
of.
character makes his big epic introduction. And I'm actually kind of glad that there's another thing that they changed that was not in the movie that was in the comics. And that was when Lex Luthor shows up. Now, there's a different version of Lex Luthor in the comics, Alexander Luthor from Earth 3, who happens to be like a super genius, and he's not even in the film at all. And you know something? That's absolutely fine. No reason for him to be in this movie. But Lex Luthor had a much bigger role in the comics. I mean, I think he was trying, there was a point where he basically gathered all of the supervillains and said, now's our chance to conquer the world. You know, it would have been fun. It would have been fun to see him do that with the villains, but I'm kind of glad that they didn't, and I'm kind of glad that they made him more of someone who is trying to help the heroes find a solution to take down the Anti-Monitor. Especially, you know what, we completely forgot to talk about the fact that the Monitor is dead.
Oh yeah.
You see,
Oops.
that's why 2 is such a weak part. We forgot that Supergirl killed the Monitor, but you know something? That also happens in the comic book.
Hmm. Yeah, that's pretty epic. No,
Yeah,
we probably should have mentioned that because that is kind of the
yeah,
beginning of 3.
yeah. But
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 no,
again, it
but
only feeds into what we said about part 2.
absolutely. It's kind of forgettable. With that said, moving into Lex Luthor, I am a huge
Yes.
Lex Luthor fan and I will stand and die on that hill. But I think that this film really made me appreciate his character just a little bit more because even though he is hated, even though he is despised by many because of how he manipulates the situation, and it's always about him, he's very self involved. It's always about how it's going to advance either his career, his monetary consumption, something specific to him. But he always is the voice of truth. And I think that's why he's so hated because no matter how you slice it, no matter which way you look at it, he's right in this film. The way he breaks it down and the way he presents it, it's like, well, you know what? It kind of sucks, but once again, Lex is right. I mean, he basically just put this scene and scenario in our face to lead us in the direction that we were going to be in anyways, and it's just like, oh, I love hate you right now, but I love you so much more because you're absolutely right. And it puts a lot of truth to a real life person like that, someone who is always very brutally honest, and someone who may not always have the best motives or the best moves for getting the situation set up to be what it is. But in the end, once you find out their truth and their reasoning behind it, it's like, well, you did a really, shitty way of presenting it to us and showing us how it's all going to unfold. But you're absolutely right, and this is another case where for me, Lex really nailed it on the head. His approach and his setup was shitty, but in the end, he was right.
So this is where I feel that we get a full-on redemption of the Tomorrowverse, because you know what I was saying throughout the entire time here tonight and through a couple of our past reviews. If you go back to our playlist and you take a look at our discussions with these films, you'll see how I'm not as passionate about some of these films because I just feel that they're not as strong as some of them used to be. But it's when John Constantine sobers up and he goes with Batman's guide. He goes into Batman goes into his head with the help of Dr. Fate, and we discover who John Constantine truly is. Again, this is not in the comics. This is something completely done for these films. Turns out that this John Constantine is a little bit more than meets the eye, because he is the same John Constantine from the New 52 storyline that started with Justice League Flashpoint Paradox all the way to Justice League Dark Apocalypse War. He basically gives Batman the whole story. It was he who told the Flash to go and start again because of what happened in their timeline. But it was a little bit more, he says, and we finally get the understanding of what it meant all the way back in Crisis Part 1, go back to before the beginning. He sent him to Apocalypse to kill Darkseid as an infant, because it was Darkseid who destroyed their world and he wanted the Flash to change it all back for the better or for worse, I guess. And again, Darkseid is a character that once again is the driving force of this whole story. And that's not something that is to be taken lightly. That's actually a very strong thing, because Darkseid is the end-all, be-all in DC Comics. He was the end game of Justice League and Justice League Unlimited. He was the end game of Superman the Animated Series. He was the end game of the New 52 timeline. And he's apparently the end game of this timeline of the Tomorrowverse, which I think is beautiful. And the fact that John Constantine created the multiverse, created all these worlds, and now the Anti-Monitor is there to destroy them all. Now we know what is at stake.
Yeah, and I think that really it ties in beautifully to the comic, even though it's not part of the story, because it really makes a lot of those panels make sense. And it kind of leads us up to the end of what we know as this trilogy. And so I just thought that storyline was very well executed, and it made a lot of sense in terms of fusing the multiverse into the monoverse.
Yeah, but I think what I really liked was the fact that they actually tied it into the previous timeline. It was something I didn't expect. And the truth of the matter is, this is where I actually wanted to raise a question to you when we actually saw this. Have you seen all the movies in that New 52 storyline?
To answer you truthfully, I don't know lines from lines, so I don't know what is in considered in the 52 storyline. My intent though is in 2025 I want to watch all the DC animated films. I know that they don't all tie into, I know that like different versions of these stories tie in starting in 2013, and then there's so many stories that fall into that category, and then phase 2 ends with what we're talking about now. But then I know that there's other miscellaneous animated films that fall in between that don't have anything to do. So that's what I'd like to do, is I'd like to group them, figure out what goes to what, and then truthfully dive in. And I know if that was your intent for 25, because you did say something about wanting to rewatch from the beginning back to back to back. So if that's something that you do, I might jump on that journey with you just so we
No,
can have deeper conversations.
what I definitely was going to ask about was to do the new 52 storyline.
Oh, that would
Just
be
because,
fun.
just because we never actually did a full-on discussion. I think when I officially roped you in on these discussions was when we were discussing the two Teen Titans movies, which are part of the new 52 storyline.
It was a
So
little before that, but I mean, it was close to that.
maybe not. I'm not necessarily sure, but no, I personally, when I saw the twist, I was like, wow. I think that to a certain degree, that moment in Crisis Part 3 sort of saves the Tomorrowverse, saying like, oh, you see, now you know why it's here. Like
Mm.
we actually had an intention. And that was when I got a little bit more miffed. And I was like, well, then maybe we should have had a couple more films, because I think it would have done some great things. But all in all, we find this out, and then we also find out the other big twist after another major sacrifice, and that is Supergirl sacrificing herself to kill the Anti-Monitor. Now, that happens in the comic books, and yes, her death scene is very epic, but I think the more epic moment is when Superman is carrying her dead body through the hallways, and it's the moment where you see heroes standing alongside villains and nobody is doing anything. I mean,
Yeah.
you would expect Joker to throw sticks of dynamite all over the place, and he's not doing anything. That's a very, very big moment. Then, of course, you get the big scene from the legendary cover where Superman's just screaming while and crying while holding the dead body of his cousin. And the thing is, that whole thing in the comics, they did that purposely because Supergirl wasn't selling books at the time. And they were like, we have to kill her. That's the only reason why she died.
I
It's just
think I think though that ended up being a regret later of the animators, because they said if we could go back and do anything differently, we probably wouldn't have killed off Supergirl.
well, you kind of can't do that if you want to make the major moments of crisis. You kind of have to kill her. But it made sense for her to die in that moment anyway, because she basically says, like, her whole world is gone. There's nothing left for me here anymore. It's like,
And that's why I wasn't sad. That made total sense. What did she have left? Brainiac 5 was dead. Her friends that never really were in existence. So really, like, who was she? She had nothing left.
yeah. And so through all of that, that is where they discover that if we're in the multiverse, there's got to be more than just one Anti-Monitor. And again, that's another scene that's not in the comic books. There's always one Anti-Monitor in the comics. So the fact that we actually see multiple Anti-Monitors going through the bleeds and then wiping out Earths, and then we get some major, major things happening. And this was more of a note from the DC animation studio about how we're heading into a new age of animation right now. We're actually now headed by James Gunn And when he announced that he was taking over DC, he said specifically that his universe was going to be entangled in many different ways, including animation.
Mhm.
So you can't move forward without saying your fond farewells. So the scenes where we see the destruction of the Super Friends, when we see the destruction of the Teen Titans Tower, when we see the final performance of Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill as Batman and the Joker, and not just them, you also see the Justice League and the Watchtower. I gotta say, that's not in the books at all, but my God, I think I might have cried when that happened when I saw that for the first time, because that was, I personally thought that those moments were extremely powerful and extremely beautiful because we are heading into a new age. As a matter of fact, December is the premiere of Creature Commandos, the first new DC animated project. I thought that this was a great opportunity to say goodbye if that's what's going to be happening now. Like, if we're never going to get any more of these older versions of these characters, you know, you got to do it now. You got to do it the right way.
Well, I do think that does segue into, like you're saying, a fond farewell, if that is what James Gunn's vision is for the future of DC. But I think we're all still very leery of what his vision of DC is going to be, where he plans on taking us. I mean, new is always exciting, but it's always a challenge because you have to really consider your audience, and I don't think that's something DC has done in a very long
I
time. You
agree.
know, we vocalize things. We are in a very prominent age of social media where we have that platform that we all have a voice, and we find these groups and these chats and these we band together and we say vividly what we want or what we want to see, and it seems like every time we do that, DC goes in the opposite direction of what the fans are vocalizing. So I think that James Gunn has a lot of backing. I think that he has obviously a team of very prominent young professionals behind him, but I think he's already kind of slapped us in the face a few times by taking away some characters that we've been with for a decade, and that we've loved, and in some cases over a decade, and he has no future plans for them, and it's really hard to see what Snyder created and where he's potentially going, and I know we don't want to open up the Snyderverse again. I know that's beating a dead horse. It's never going to
Yeah,
happen. But it was going somewhere, and it was
I thought so.
fantastic, and it was beautiful, and given time and the right funding, it could have been a really epic thing, and I think it could have been very comparable to the Marvel universe. Um but we squashed it, and now that that light has dimmed, I think that, as you're saying, this is a very powerful way and a very sad way to say goodbye to so much that we love about DC and the animation and the world of animation that DC has given us over many decades. But you do have to sometimes set aside your pride and say, we have to make waves and room for the new future of animation, of writing, of storylines, of characters, of actors, of voicing. Let's just see where it takes us. I mean, maybe we are being prudes and just stuck in our old ways. Maybe it's going to be epic, and maybe we're going to sit here a year from now and talk about really exciting things that are happening in the world of animation concerning DC. But for now, I think that was a really um it was a really respectful way of giving us, the older generation, a way to say goodbye.
Yeah, and then at the end, we basically discover the miracle machine that was left by the Legion of Superheroes. And then we create a brand new dimension. And basically, along with the help of the Spectre, who's been floating around this entire time, apparently he has a bigger role in the comics, but he didn't really have much of a role here. I mean, the fact,
Yeah, he had a huge role in the comic and so minute in this film.
yeah, I mean, even, I mean, we're crying out loud to get Lou Diamond Phillips to voice, you gotta give him
Right?
something. But so basically, they say that if you jump into this void, you are going to be brought into a singular world, a singular universe. You will embody everything of your multiversal self, but you won't remember anything, and no one will remember that or you, etc., etc. So basically, everybody, especially with Batman, with the most abundance of caution, jumps in because they know that if they don't, there's nothing left here. So outside of what Constantine did in the beginning with Flash, they have to do this to a certain degree in a different way, and hopefully it turns out good and better for the situation.
Did you say with the exception of Batman?
Batman had doubts.
Whoa, you're talking about, okay, I thought you meant like he physically didn't jump, because the only one
Oh
that was the
no, he
exception to
jumped
the,
in, but
yeah, he jumped in.
he was basically saying, "I'm gonna jump, but I'm not happy about it."
Is Batman ever happy though? Come on, let's be realistic. It doesn't, you could give him the world and Batman would still be a skeptic.
Exactly,
So,
exactly.
and honestly, I think it was so perfectly done that everybody that should have gone into this monoverse, everyone that didn't shouldn't have, because there was that point for Constantine, his role had been filled. And I give complete hats off to the Question. He is now one of my new favorite characters
Yeah.
just for the one liner. Just
Oh
for the
yeah.
one liner.
Yeah.
False reality on principle. I mean, come on. And if that doesn't segue into kind of how we're all feeling about the new future of DC, I don't know what else you all
See,
want.
that's one of the few reasons why I love Bruce Timm to death, because Bruce Timm will, out of the blue, just take a random character in the world of DC and turn them into something so concrete and so memorable. He did that with the Question in Justice League Unlimited. Nobody knew who in God's name the Question was until Bruce Timm got his hand on it, especially unless you read the comic books in the Silver Age and the Bronze Age, you didn't know who the Question was. I didn't know who the Question was. Him in Justice League Unlimited opened my eyes to this character, and I'm like, this is like Batman on freaking steroids. Like, this guy is a sincere wackadoo, and yet there's no reason to doubt this man.
Absolutely
I mean,
not.
if it wasn't for Bruce Timm, I wouldn't have a Question Funko Pop. I'm so glad that I have that character. So, yes, he's here in this film. I don't think he's used in the best ways as if Bruce Timm would have used him, but he's there and he's good for what he is, you know?
Well, you know what? He got the best one liner in the whole series. And honestly, it completely encapsulates, I think, how more of the older generation DC fans are feeling and thinking about the future of DC. You know, we are skeptics right now. We are very fearful. We are like the last of the characters or the people left in the multiverse. Like, should we actually, try this monoverse? Should we take the leap of faith? Should we see what's on the other side? And I really feel that that's me as a fan right now. I want to love it, I want to embrace it, because I'm always about what's next, what's new. But what's new and what's next isn't always best, and so I'm taking it, project by project, day by day, just seeing what is presented. But I definitely have a newfound love for the Question.
Yeah, I
No
mean,
questions asked.
yeah, I mean, that's what's actually, I mean, the thing is, you mentioned some really good things there. And I mean, it's happening in DC Comics this week. This week is a big week for DC and the comics because it's the start of the DC All In initiative. They're basically giving us brand new jumping on points, whether it's a new group of staff writing a current comic book, or having the current creative team on a certain comic giving us a brand new epic story arc, along with a brand new multiversal world called the Absolute Universe, which is being headlined by Scott Snyder, a great writer who wrote some amazing Batman stories in the early 2000s. So the question really is, are we all in, or are we just going to jump off this boat? I mean, I really thought that after the summer epic of Absolute Power that I was not going to be reading any DC comics anymore. I really thought that it was going to take a massive dive like Marvel has months ago. I'm barely reading anything from Marvel, but just seeing who's on board, seeing what these new stories are going to be, hearing from people who got the opportunity to read Absolute Batman #1 and say it's a really good book, I got more interested every little step of the way. So I'm all in. I am. I'm picking
That's
up
good.
I'm picking up the DC All In Special #1 this week. I'm reading the new Batman story arc, and I'm extremely excited for what the rest of this year is going to hold for DC. So I don't know what the world of animation is going to hold for DC, though, but you know what? I think that the Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths Part 3 ended on a very good note. I would give this movie 3.5 stars out of 4.
I will say before I give my star rating, I did appreciate the end of Psycho Pirate's version in the book more than I did the
Yeah.
film, because I think it was much more powerful in the epilogue in the written part. However, because it was just funny, it was comical. Like, am I the only person that remembers the multiverse? I just think that's great, and the fact that it ends in Arkham Asylum in the written word.
Yeah.
However, I think that it ended very well. I think that they encapsulated the story, they sealed it. Everybody kind of has a new beginning, to include Diana, which, we know that she sacrificed herself to even give us the segue to the monoverse. So to kind of see her on the other side gave way to what the Spectre said, the hope. So I took that as hope in the future of DC as a whole. And, that's kind of where I land. I do have hope in the future of DC because I am a DC girl at heart. I always will be. I will always give it more of light and more of my energy and money than Marvel. Although I have read quite a bit of Marvel this year, which is a new territory for me. But I am excited to see what lies ahead, both in the written and in terms of character development. But animation and movies are always two very separate things, so we'll leave the movies and everything to James Gunn, and I'm hoping that the animators just carry on the torch. There's always going to be a nod to the past. There has to be, because that's what that paved the way for where we are now.
Yeah.
But if this kind of kills off the past and all we get is the new version of DC, then God help us make it good.
Look, I say this when it comes to comic book movies these days: expect the worst and hope for the best.
This is true.
That's
On
what I
that
do
note,
these days.
I will give the final movie 3.5 stars.
Well, I think that's going to wrap it up. It was really great to sit down and talk DC films with you, Cami. I mean, I don't know if we'll be able to do this more frequently. I mean, we always try to capture this once a year. I mean, I actually we could have reviewed Watchmen Part 1 this year, but I actually have bigger plans for Watchmen, and I'll talk to you about them before we head out for the evening. But, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody in between, thank you very much for watching, and please leave a comment in the box below. Let us know your thoughts on these films. Let us know your thoughts on the Tomorrowverse or anything DC animated in general. We'd love to talk to you. Hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell. We'll be back with other videos in the near future. We still have Batman to discuss this year, and God willing, Cami and I will talk some more Ninja Turtles because that's been very much lacking. We will, and we will see you in the next one.